Hello! Welcome back to Brenda's Books. Thank you for coming back to listen to more of Queen Andraya. If you would like to follow Brenda's Books online, I am on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. This is Chapter 2. Here we go. Chapter 2, Deceit and Desire. Queen Andraya sauntered across the cobblestone paths in the front courtyard of the palace. It was a fine-looking building, she had to admit. Its cream-colored bricks stood 4 stories high with 4 pointed spires. Each spire held a metal Chaldean flag, with a gold relief engraving of a soldier charging out from the rising sun. The courtyard stretched 1/2 mile before reaching the locked golden gates. A long stream tumbled over rocks down the center of the courtyard, lined with yellow daffodils and pink periwinkles. All a beautiful result of Chaldraya's fertile ground due to its mild climate. Andraya stared at the palace she'd now called home for 1 entire year. She couldn't help but think of her old home in the island kingdom of Medine, with a much smaller palace, much less wealth, and much more kindness. She sighed as she thought of her father's tender face. She must write to him and ask for his advice with these new foreign relation problems she was facing. He would know what to do. Then again, the only advice her father had ever given her was, "You must make your own decisions." Just then, Andraya spotted an older, somewhat hefty gentleman pacing in front of the palace steps. "Father," Andraya whispered aloud. She lengthened her stride toward the palace, her high heels clicking along the cobblestones with every step. The gentleman's head snapped up at her approach. Andraya's heart fell when she saw the round face of her royal treasurer and not her father. His thick eyebrows shot up as he quickened his short steps in her direction. "Your Majesty! Your Majesty, I have urgent news for you!" He paused and bowed when he reached her. Even when he straightened to his full height, Andraya's 3-inch heels had her towering over the plump gentleman. Despite popular prejudice that female royalty must be short and dainty, Andraya loved being tall, and perhaps her height would help the nobles to forget her young age. "Your Majesty, a gross error occurred at the coalition meeting this morning," he said, slightly winded. Andraya sniffed. "Indeed, Besnik. The translator misrepresented the Prince of Deldria, Your Majesty." Andraya tilted her head. "How do you mean?" Besnik squared his shoulders and smoothed his tie. "I speak Deldrian, and upon my word, the prince was misrepresented." Andraya raised one eyebrow. "And how is it you know the language of the tiny kingdom we just opened communication with a few months ago?" The treasurer removed his spectacles and placed them in his breast pocket. "I was an apprentice to an accountant in Deldria for 5 years, before the kingdom closed themselves off to the other islands many years ago. I'm very pleased they have opened up communication again." Besnik grinned, causing the wrinkles around his eyes to crimp together. Andraya stared at him directly. "Are you certain, Besnik?" He grabbed her hand in a fatherly gesture, reminding Andraya that her own father chose to send Besnik with her to Chaldrea when she was married, because he trusted him. "Have I ever spoken anything but the truth to you, my queen?" Besnik asked. Andraya shook her head and tightened her hold on his hand. "I believe you, Besnik. You've been nothing but good to me. But if you're right, then that means—" "Yes?" Besnik prodded. Andraya let out a sigh. "I threw him out with the other dogs." Besnik patted her hand before releasing it. "That is just fine, my queen. I've never seen your bodyguard Hudson so delighted." His shoulders shook with a deep chuckle. Andraya lifted one corner of her mouth. "This may be difficult to prove. It's your word against the translators. I don't believe I will find another person in the royal court who can speak the Deldrian tongue. And what motive could the translator have to deceive the rest of us?" Besnik pointed a finger at her. "That is the mystery. It may be noteworthy, however, that Chancellor Dolian vehemently opposed the late king's decision, may he rest in peace, to open communication with Deldria." "Well, he is the royal advisor. They argued all the time," Andraya replied, glancing up at the very window where she had often heard such disagreements. "What shall we do, Your Majesty?" Besnik asked, trying to catch her eye again. The Queen turned to look at him. "I would like you to serve as Prince Stephen's translator at the formal apology assembly this afternoon. I was just on my way to tell the butler to make the arrangements. Hopefully we can clear things up then, while everyone is present." Besnick nodded. "As you wish, Your Majesty. Then I will have that translator put on the next boat." "A perfect plan, my Queen. I shall take my leave." He bowed and pivoted in the other direction. "Besnick?" Andraya called. He turned to face her. "What did the prince say?" "Only how much he loathes slavery, and the kingdom of Gulen, which practices it." Andraya pursed her lips and gazed out at the stream again. "And I dare say, my Queen, given the fact that you are the daughter of the King of Medine, I suspect you might also be an abolitionist?" She shifted her gaze back to his. "It's one virtue I did inherit. A virtue I admire, Your Majesty." The Queen sucked in a breath. It was the very thing she had longed for. A kind word from a nobleman. Certainly Besnick was not part of the nobility, but his actions were noble. "Thank you, Besnick." He bowed again and left her sight. Andraya slammed her open book shut and added it to the ever-growing pile on the desk in front of her. She was determined to find answers, even if it meant she had to read through every single book on foreign affairs in the palace library. She cringed at the thought as she glanced around at the enormous room, full of mahogany shelves, stocked with books of every kind. She grabbed another book from the box at her feet and flipped through pages and pages of past Chaldrayan trading negotiations until she found the one she wanted. Oh my, here it is. King Gordon signed a contract with the King of Gulen. Deceitful man. Andraya traced her finger along the lines of gold where the terms of trade were outlined. She shook her head. Gold-lined books? That expense could have been spent in countless ways that were more productive. Andraya reached over to the second desk that she had pulled beside her own, where her absolute favorite book in the kingdom lay. Chaldrayan Law. The binding tripled in size compared to the others. Andraya heaved the heavy book and placed it on top of the other in front of her. She flipped through more pages, searching for a particular section which she knew would give her loopholes to get out of the contract with Gulen. She didn't know how many members of the coalition wanted to trade with the despicable slave-owning kingdom, but she just had to persuade her own council from voting in favor of it. "What are you so engrossed in now?" whispered a delicate voice in Andraya's ear. The Queen jumped in surprise. She whipped her head around to a young lady crouched beside her. "Colleen, are you unaware that you must have yourself announced before you address the Queen? But I just love seeing you pop out of your concentration like that," Colleen said with a silly grin, making a popping motion with her fingers. Andraya stared into Colleen's innocent brown eyes. Her brunette hair was tied up in a messy bun. One loose strand trailed its way over her pale pink gown. "Why are you wearing that apron?" Andraya asked. "Harriet needed my help with the sheets today. With all the extra visitors you have, they've been a lot to handle." "I suspect so. But why did you say yes?" Andraya asked. "Because she's the head housekeeper. And I'm the head of the head housekeeper, and I told you that you no longer need to work like that." Colleen bounced on her heels a bit. "I remember, but I get so bored while you're off doing business. I hate sitting around doing nothing." "Bored?" Andraya's eyes swelled. "I'm certain I would no longer recognize that sensation even if I did have the time to feel it." "Yes, you have been so busy since you were deemed head crown. Tell me." Colleen tugged loosely on Andraya's sleeve. "What was it like in that meeting with all those men?" Andraya laughed without humor. "Exhausting. They behaved like wild animals." Colleen leaned forward with genuine interest. Andraya moved to go on, but the stoic voice of the butler interrupted her. "Your Majesty, Lord Bartholomew Bobbins would like the pleasure of speaking with you." Andraya glanced up to see Bartholomew looking nervous and frail next to the big-boned butler. Colleen shot to her feet and curtsied. "I will see to that immediately, Your Majesty." She spun around and scurried out the door. "Miss Colleen," Andraya called. Colleen scurried back. "Yes, Your Majesty? Do come back and report when you are finished." Colleen threw her a knowing look, not quite hiding her smile. She offered a deep curtsy and exited into the hallway. "I shall be standing by, Your Majesty," the butler said with a bow. "Thank you, Alvin," Andraya replied. She didn't know if Alvin was aware of her secret friendship with Colleen. He gave her no indication if he did. On the other hand, Andraya knew Bartholomew, despite his awkward manners, would not share the same indifference on the subject. "Good morning, Lord Bartholomew." The gentleman bowed low. "Good morning, my queen," he said, with the slightest squeak in his voice. Andraya gestured to the velvet chair across from her. "Please, have a seat." Bartholomew twitched like he would rather do anything else, but he complied without protest. Once sitting, his fingers fidgeted on his lap. Andraya waited for him to speak, but all he did was perspire from his hairline. "May I inquire to the reason for this visit?" Andraya asked. Yes, my queen, He pulled out a handkerchief from his breast pocket and dabbed his forehead. "I want to tell you that I do not share the opinion of the other councilmen. I believe you make a fine head crown." Andraya's lips curled up. "That is very kind, Bartholomew. I wrote you this." He reached in his breast pocket again and pulled out a folded piece of paper and handed it to Andraya. She unfolded it carefully and smoothed it out on top of her open book. "Does it please Her Majesty?" the Lord asked in earnest. Andraya glanced up at him under her eyelashes. "I am uncertain. I have not had the chance to read it." Bartholomew nodded, then started wringing his hands. Andraya lowered her eyes to read the note, with Bartholomew's neat penmanship. "My dear queen, your beauty exceeds that of all the earth. Your mystery exceeds that of all the earth. Your intelligence exceeds all the inhabitants of the earth. You, my queen, exceed all excellence. Sincerely, Lord Bartholomew." Andraya cocked her head at the page in bewilderment. She glanced up at the lord in front of her. His face colored like a beet. He clutched the arms of his chair so hard his veins bulged. "Does it please Her Majesty?" he squeaked. Andraya glanced down at the page, then up at Bartholomew. What a nervous sheep he was. "It is very kind," she replied. He shot to his feet then. "I will take my leave now." He bowed in haste and bolted out the door. Andraya rubbed her mouth as she smiled to herself. She must at least give him credit for moving quickly. Her required 8 days of mourning ended not 3 days ago. "Alvin," Andraya called. The butler entered the library. "Yes, Your Majesty?" "Please send for my lady-in-waiting." "With pleasure," he said, bowing his chocolate-haired head. "Oh, and Alvin?" He pivoted to face her just as he crossed the threshold. "How much of the conversation did you hear between myself and Lord Bartholomew?" "Nothing at all, if it pleases the Queen." Behind his stoic expression, Alvin's eyes smiled. "It would please me. He doesn't need another reason for nobles to laugh at him." Alvin bowed and exited the room. Andraya pored over her books for the next few minutes until Colleen returned. "Goodness me, Cook is in a mood today," she said, plopping in the seat next to Andraya. "What did Lord Bartholomew want?" Andraya finished reading the paragraph she was on as she slid the Lord's poem over to Colleen. Before long, Colleen burst into a fit of giggles. Andraya couldn't help smiling as she snatched the paper back. "The poor man was shaking so hard I thought he might have a stroke." Colleen laughed some more. "Oh, I wish someone would write me a love letter, even if it were as ridiculous as that." "If you encouraged Oliver a little more, I suspect he would write you one." Colleen rolled her head. "I do not care for Oliver's interest." "I've noticed," Andraya said with a smile, as she placed bookmarks in several books. "But he's the council scribe, and if you two were married, you could live with the other court officials in the palace, instead of down in the servants' quarters." Colleen hacked out gagging sounds rather vigorously. Andraya laughed. "Very well, the case is closed." She started piling her books back into the box. Colleen did the same. "Are you finished studying?" "At present, yes. But now I need to write up my initial notes for my handsome scribe." Andraya paused and looked pointedly at Colleen, which earned her a dramatic eye roll. "Notes for what?" "Formal apologies." She pulled some paper and a quill close to her. Colleen's eyes bulged with so much curiosity, Andraya had to laugh. She then related all that happened in the council room and what Besnik had revealed. Colleen gasped. "Oh my! Are you all right?" Colleen clasped the young queen's hand in hers. "Of course." Compared to Gordon, all of those cads are saints. Andraya dipped her quill in some ink, refusing to acknowledge Colleen's frown. Was anyone there as handsome as Chancellor Dolian? Perhaps the prince. It's hard to say. At any rate, I must get going on this. If you are too bored sitting here, you're welcome to go help cook with the extra dishes. Andraya meant her comment to be teasing, but Colleen stood and said, "Very well. When do you need to dress for the formal apologies?" "In 1 hour." "And how does the most gorgeous head crown want to present herself?" Andraya flashed a smile. "Fierce and beautiful." And that concludes Chapter 2. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you come back next Thursday for Chapter 3, which is called Formal Apologies. If you want to find out more about Brenda's books, you can visit brendasbooks.net. Until next time, take care.